I decided to go camping alone. I had done it before plenty of times, but this trip was different. I wasn't sticking to the usual campgrounds. I wanted real solitude, somewhere deep in the woods where I wouldn't see another person for miles. That was the whole point. I picked a spot in a national forest, far off any marked trails. I had studied the maps, checked the terrain, and made sure I had everything I needed. Plenty of food, a good tent, extra layers, a sharp knife, and my rifle. Not that I expected to need the rifle, but when you're out in the middle of nowhere, it's better to have it. The drive out was long. First, it was pavement, then a winding gravel road, and finally a narrow dirt trail barely wide enough for my truck. By the time I reached a good place to park, I was already deep into the forest. The trees pressed in on all sides, thick and dark, the kind of place where cell service didn't exist. I grabbed my pack, slung my rifle over my shoulder, and hiked in. It was about an hour to the clearing I had chosen. No signs of recent campers, no trash, no fire pits, no footprints. Just untouched wilderness. Exactly what I wanted. I set up my tent near a small stream, got my fire going, and settled in. As the sun lowered, the woods filled with sound. Birds calling, insects buzzing, the occasional rustle of something moving through the undergrowth. Felt alive, and that was comforting. But as night fell, the noises changed. The usual sounds faded. No more birds, no more insects, just the whisper of the wind in the trees. I noticed it, but I told myself it was nothing. Probably just the temperature dropping. Maybe a predator nearby, a fox, maybe even a cougar, making everything else go still. I had my rifle. I wasn't worried. I ate my meal, sat by the fire, and listened to the quiet. The silence stretched on longer than it should have. That's when the unease started. I shook it off and turned in for the night. Sometime later, I woke up. I wasn't sure what had pulled me from sleep. I lay still, listening. The fire outside had burned down to embers, giving off just enough light to faintly glow through the walls of my tent. Then I heard it, a branch snapping, not close but not far, somewhere in the trees. I waited, barely breathing. Nothing, just the sound of my own heartbeat. Then another snap, closer this time. This wasn't some small animal moving through the underbrush. The steps were careful, deliberate, human. I reached for my rifle, sliding it close. My hand was steady, but my pulse was racing. Who the hell would be out here? There were no trails, no campgrounds, no reason for anyone to be this far off the grid. I stayed still, listening. The footsteps stopped. Silence. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. I lay there, heart hammering, waiting. 5 minutes passed, maybe 10. Nothing. Eventually, I convinced myself it was nothing. Maybe a deer. Maybe my mind playing tricks on me. I forced myself to close my eyes. And then a sound. Breathing. Soft. Slow. Just outside my tent. I froze. Every muscle in my body went rigid. This wasn't my imagination. This wasn't an animal. Someone was standing inches from my tent, listening. I gripped my rifle tight, ready to rip open the tent and confront whoever was there. But I hesitated. What if they had a gun? What if they were waiting for me to make the first move? I held my breath, waiting. The breathing continued, steady and calm. Then slowly it faded. Footsteps moving away, back into the trees. Slow, measured, like they weren't in a hurry, like they wanted me to know they were leaving. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I lay there, rifle in hand, waiting for them to come back. They didn't. At first light, I got out of my tent, rifle raised, scanning the tree line. The forest was still, quiet. I walked the perimeter of my campsite. No footprints, no broken branches, no sign that anyone had been there. But I knew what I had heard. I packed up fast. No breakfast, no fire, just stuffing my gear into my pack as quickly as I could. I wasn't sticking around. The hike back to my truck felt longer. Every step, I expected to hear those footsteps again. Every shadow between the trees looked like someone watching. I reached my truck, threw my gear in, and got in fast, locking the doors out of instinct. The engine roared to life, breaking the silence. I turned onto the dirt road, speeding down it faster than I should have, heart pounding, eyes scanning the mirrors. No one followed. I made it back to civilization without looking back. I don't know who was out there. I don't know what they wanted. But I do know one thing. They weren't lost. They weren't camping. They had no reason to be there. And they were watching me. I haven't been camping alone since. I never planned to stay in the cabin for long. I just needed a quiet place to clear my head, to get away from the noise of the city. My uncle had left it to me in his will, a small one-room structure deep in the woods, miles from the nearest road. I never knew him well, but when I saw the place for the first time, I understood why he had chosen to live out here alone. It was peaceful. No traffic, no neighbors, just the sound of the wind in the trees and the occasional snap of a branch under the weight of some unseen animal. It was the middle of January when I arrived. Snow covered the ground in thick layers, and the only way in was by snowmobile. I had packed enough supplies to last 2 weeks: canned food, bottled water, extra fuel, batteries, and a thick sleeping bag. The cabin itself was simple. One main room with a wood stove, a small kitchen, and a cot pushed against the wall. There was a shed out back where my uncle had kept tools, along with a small supply of firewood. The first few days were quiet. I spent my time reading, chopping wood, and exploring the area around the cabin. The snow made everything feel still, like the whole world had been put on pause. At night, the temperature dropped fast. I kept the wood stove burning, listening to the crackling of the fire as I lay in my sleeping bag. But on the 5th night, things changed. I had just finished eating a can of chili and was sitting by the fire when I heard something outside. At first, I thought it was the wind, a deep, hollow sound moving through the trees. But then I heard it again, closer this time. A heavy crunching sound. Footsteps in the snow. I set my spoon down and reached for the flashlight. The cabin had no windows, just a thick wooden door with a small peephole. I moved to it slowly, my breath fogging up the wood as I pressed my eye against the hole. Darkness. Nothing but the shadows of trees, their branches shifting slightly in the wind. I waited, listening. The footsteps had stopped. I told myself it was probably an animal, a deer maybe, or a moose passing through. I shook off the feeling and went back to the cot, but I didn't sleep well that night. The next morning, I found the tracks. They were human, not boot prints, bare feet. The snow had softened the edges, but I could see the shape of toes, the curve of an arch. They led from the tree line to the cabin, stopping just a few feet from the door. Whoever it was, they had stood there for a long time before walking back into the woods. I felt a chill run through me. No one lived out here. The nearest town was over 40 miles away. If someone was walking around barefoot in the snow, they wouldn't last long. I scanned the trees, half expecting to see someone standing there, watching. But the woods were empty. I spent the rest of the day uneasy. I checked my supplies, made sure the door was locked, and kept the shotgun close. I had brought it more as a precaution against bears, but now it felt like a necessary comfort. That night, I kept the fire going and tried to stay awake, but at some point, I must have drifted off. Then the sound came again. This time it was closer, a slow, deliberate crunching in the snow. I sat up, heart pounding, and grabbed the flashlight. The shotgun was already in my lap. I moved to the peephole, my hands sweating despite the cold. A shape stood outside. A man, tall, thin, naked. His skin was pale, almost blending in with the snow. He wasn't moving, just standing there, staring at the door. I swallowed hard. My breath felt trapped in my throat. Then he took a step forward. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed a log from the fire and jammed it against the peephole, blocking the view. My hands were shaking. I backed away slowly, my pulse hammering in my ears. The footsteps came closer. Then they stopped. Minutes passed, maybe an hour. The fire crackled. The wind howled against the walls. I didn't dare look outside. When the sun came up, I finally forced myself to check. He was gone, but the footprints remained. This time, they led around the cabin, circling it again and again. I didn't stay another night. I packed my things, fueled up the snowmobile, and left as fast as I could. The whole way back, I kept checking over my shoulder, half expecting to see him standing at the tree line, watching. I never went back to that cabin, but sometimes, in the middle of the night, I wake up to the sound of footsteps outside my window, and I wonder if he ever really stopped following me. This is just the start of a longer version. Let me know if you want an extended version, and I'll add more details, build up, and tension. I was never the kind of person who took risks. I liked things planned, controlled, predictable. That's why I hesitated when my brother, Jake, invited me on a camping trip deep in the mountains. He had always been the adventurous one, the kind of guy who loved pushing himself, testing his limits. I was the opposite, but I hadn't seen him in months, and he made it sound like an easy trip. 2 nights, nothing extreme, just a chance to catch up and unwind. I agreed even though I had a bad feeling about it. We left early in the morning, his truck packed with gear. The drive took hours, winding through narrow roads, climbing higher into the mountains. The farther we went, the fewer people we saw. Towns turned into clusters of cabins, then just trees and empty road. By the time we reached the trailhead, we hadn't seen another car for over an hour. We parked, grabbed our packs, and started the hike. The air was crisp, clean, the kind of air that made you feel small in the best way. The trees were massive, stretching high, their thick branches blocking most of the sunlight. The trail was rough, barely used, just dirt and scattered rocks cutting through the dense forest. Jake led the way, moving fast, always a few steps ahead. I struggled to keep up, my legs burning as we climbed higher. We followed the trail for miles, cutting off at a small clearing near a river. It was the perfect spot, flat ground, plenty of space, water nearby. It looked untouched, like no one had been there in years. We set up camp fast, pitching our tents, gathering firewood. Jake built the fire while I laid out our food. We ate as the sun set, the sky fading from orange to deep blue. The forest was quiet, peaceful. No distant sounds of cars, no voices, just the wind moving through the trees and the faint rush of the river. Felt good, better than I expected. I fell asleep fast, exhaustion from the hike pulling me under. I woke up sometime in the night. At first, I didn't know why. My body felt heavy, my mind foggy with sleep. Then I heard it, movement outside my tent. Slow, deliberate steps, crunching softly in the dirt. I told myself it was Jake, maybe up for a piss or checking the fire, but something about the way the footsteps moved didn't feel right. Too slow, too careful. I held my breath, listening. The steps circled the tent once, then again. I wanted to call out, to ask if it was him, but something stopped me. The footsteps paused. Then they moved away, fading into the trees. I stayed awake for hours, heart pounding, ears straining for any sound, but I heard nothing else. Eventually, I drifted back to sleep. The next morning, I stepped outside, trying to shake the unease from the night before. The fire was still smoldering, Jake's tent zipped shut. I looked around, checking the dirt for tracks, and I saw them. Footprints, not boots, not hiking shoes, bare feet, large, deep impressions in the dirt, circling my tent, then leading off into the woods. I stared at them, my stomach twisting. They weren't Jake's. They were too big, the toes too spread out, the shape unnatural. I forced myself to look away. Maybe I was overthinking. Maybe it was nothing. I didn't mention it to Jake. We spent the day exploring, hiking farther up the mountain, following an old game trail to a ridge with an incredible view. It should have been fun, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Every time we stopped, I found myself listening, scanning the trees. We made it back to camp just before sunset. The fire felt like a comfort, a barrier between us and whatever was out there. That night, I barely slept. I listened. The forest was too quiet. No wind, no distant calls of animals, just silence. Then, sometime in the early morning, I heard it again. The footsteps. This time, they didn't circle the tent. They stopped right outside. I lay frozen, barely breathing. The fabric of the tent shifted, something pressing against it. Not a hand, a face. I could see the outline, the faintest impression of features. Stayed there inches away, unmoving. Then it was gone. I heard the footsteps retreat into the trees. The sun couldn't come fast enough. When morning finally arrived, I got up, checking the ground. The footprints were there again, closer this time. Jake was already up, messing with the fire, acting normal. He didn't notice anything. I almost told him, but I didn't. We packed up later that day, cutting the trip short. Jake was annoyed, said we had planned for 2 nights, but I didn't care. I needed to leave. The hike back felt longer. Every step, I fought the urge to look over my shoulder. When we finally reached the truck, I felt the tension in my chest ease. We drove back in silence, the trees thinning, the mountains shrinking in the rearview mirror. I didn't say anything, and I never told Jake what I saw. I don't know who or what was out there. I don't want to know. I had planned this hike for months. It was a remote trail in the mountains, deep in the woods, the kind of place where you could walk for days without seeing another person. That was the appeal. I wanted solitude, a break from the noise of life, the endless stream of emails and phone calls, the constant pull of obligations. I had done plenty of hikes before, but nothing this isolated. I parked my truck at the small dirt lot where the trailhead started. There were no other cars. That was a good sign. It meant I'd have the place to myself. I slung my heavy pack over my shoulders, adjusted the straps, and stepped onto the narrow path leading into the woods. The first few miles were easy. The trail was well-defined, the air was crisp, and the silence was almost overwhelming. No traffic sounds, no distant hum of civilization. Just the rustling of leaves, the occasional bird call, the steady crunch of my boots on the dirt. Felt good. I felt strong, like I could walk forever. As the day went on, the trail became rougher. Roots snaked across the path. Rocks jutted out in odd places. I had to watch my step. I checked my map frequently, making sure I was on course. There were no markers, no signs, just the thin dirt path winding through miles of dense forest. I liked that. Felt like I was truly out there, away from everything. I hiked all day, stopping only for short breaks. By late afternoon, my legs were sore, and I was drenched in sweat. I found a small clearing near a stream and decided to set up camp. I unrolled my tent, set up my little stove, and boiled water for a dehydrated meal. The sun dipped low behind the trees, casting long shadows. The air cooled fast. After eating, I sat by the stream, listening to the water. There was something about the sound. It was peaceful, but at the same time, it made me uneasy. Maybe because it was the only sound. The woods were quiet, too quiet. I told myself I was just overthinking. I was alone after all, nothing to be scared of. I crawled into my tent and zipped myself in. Took a while to fall asleep, but eventually, exhaustion won. I woke up to a sound, a sharp snap like a branch breaking. My eyes opened wide. I held my breath, listened. Silence. Maybe it was an animal. A deer, a raccoon. The woods were full of them. I closed my eyes again. Then, another snap. Closer. I sat up, my heart pounding. I reached for my flashlight and flicked it on. The thin beam cut through the darkness. I aimed it at the trees. Nothing. Just the tangled mess of branches and shadows. I told myself it was nothing. Falling branch. A small animal. My mind was playing tricks on me. I lay back down, forced myself to breathe slow. Eventually, I drifted off. The next day, I packed up and kept moving. I had planned to hike deeper into the woods before looping back in a few days. The trail was even rougher now, steeper. I had to use my hands to steady myself on the incline. The trees were thicker, the path narrower. Felt different, more isolated. By midday, I noticed something strange. The forest was silent. Not just quiet, silent. No birds, no rustling leaves, no distant scurrying of animals. Felt wrong, like the woods were holding their breath. I kept walking. Then I saw something on the trail ahead. A footprint, not mine. It was fresh. The edges were crisp. A deep imprint in the dirt. It was a boot print. Someone else was out here. I felt a mix of emotions. On one hand, it was a relief. I wasn't completely alone. But on the other hand, something about it made my stomach knot up. I hadn't seen any other cars at the trailhead. No signs of campsites, no smoke from fires. Just this footprint, deep in the dirt, heading in the same direction as me. I kept moving, but now I was hyper-aware of my surroundings. My ears strained for any sound. My eyes scanned every shadow. An hour later, I saw something else. A piece of fabric caught on a branch. Dark-colored, maybe from a jacket. It wasn't old. It hadn't been there long. I started to feel like I was being watched. I moved faster. The trail wound up a steep hill, and when I reached the top, I stopped to catch my breath. That's when I saw it. Down in the valley below, deep in the trees, there was a small clearing. And in that clearing, there was a tent. It wasn't mine, and it wasn't an ordinary campsite. From this distance, I could barely make it out, but something about it looked wrong. The tent was sagging, almost collapsed. There were dark shapes scattered around it. I pulled out my binoculars for a closer look. The tent was torn open. Gear was scattered around. And next to it, half hidden in the brush, was something that made my blood turn to ice. A backpack. It looked just like mine. Same brand, same color, same model. I felt sick. I had a choice. I could go down there, see if someone needed help, or I could turn around and get the hell out. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to leave. I listened. I turned around and started walking back the way I came. Fast. I didn't stop to rest, didn't stop to eat. I just moved. But as the hours passed, I realized something horrifying. The trail didn't look right. I checked my map again and again. I should have been getting close to where I camped the first night, but nothing looked familiar. Then I saw something ahead on the trail. A footprint, deep in the dirt. Not mine. And it was facing the opposite direction, like someone had been following me. Panic set in. I started running. My heavy pack slammed against my back. Branches whipped my arms and face, but I didn't care. I just needed to get out. Then up ahead, something moved. A shadow slipping between the trees. I didn't stop. I kept running. I don't know how long I ran before I finally saw something through the trees. The parking lot. My truck. I sprinted to it, yanked open the door, threw my pack inside. My hands were shaking as I jammed the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life. I slammed it into reverse, sped out of there so fast my tires kicked up gravel. I didn't stop until I was miles away. Even then, I kept looking in my mirrors, half expecting to see someone standing at the edge of the woods, watching, waiting. I never found out who was out there, and I don't want to, But I know one thing for sure. I wasn't alone. There's a reason people tell you to stick to marked trails. I used to think that was just something they said to keep tourists from getting lost. I had spent years hiking alone, cutting through backcountry, bushwhacking through thick forests, scrambling over ridges where no clear trail existed. I was careful, experienced, and always prepared. I knew how to read a map, how to use a compass, how to find my way back if things went wrong. But none of that mattered in the end. This happened 2 years ago, and I still wake up some nights, sweating, hearing the sound of dry branches snapping behind me. It was supposed to be a simple 3-day trip. A loop through a remote section of national forest, miles away from any towns or roads. I had found the route online, an old logging trail that connected to a high ridge with incredible views. Not many people hiked it anymore, which made it perfect for me. I liked being alone in the woods. It was the only place that ever felt right. I packed everything I needed: food, water, first aid kit, knife, GPS, map. The forecast was clear. No storms, no high winds. I started early, parking my truck at the trailhead before the sun was fully up. The first few miles were easy, winding through thick pines, the ground soft with fallen needles. The air was cool, crisp. Birds called out in the distance, the rhythmic sound of woodpeckers echoing through the trees. I felt good, strong. By noon, I had covered a lot of ground. The trail was overgrown in places, but still easy to follow. It climbed gradually, leading toward the ridge. I took my time, stopping to filter water from a clear, cold creek. I ate a quick meal, checked my map. Everything was going exactly as planned. But then, a few miles later, I saw something strange. A shoe, half buried in the dirt, just off the trail. It was old, torn, the laces missing. The kind of thing you'd expect to see in a thrift store bin, not lying in the middle of the woods. I frowned, nudging it with my boot. It didn't make sense. This wasn't a popular area. The last trip report I had read was over a year old. There shouldn't have been anyone out here. I tried to ignore it, kept moving. An hour later, I found something worse. A backpack, faded, ripped open down one side, half hidden beneath a fallen branch. It had been there a long time. The fabric was stiff, stained with dirt. I crouched down, my stomach tightening. There was no ID inside. No wallet, no phone. Just a few rusted zippers, a torn piece of fabric where a logo used to be. I stood up quickly, wiping my hands on my pants. My pulse was pounding now. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe some hunter had abandoned it. Maybe a hiker had lost it years ago. But I didn't believe that. I kept moving faster now. My skin felt tight, like something was pressing in on me. The trees thinned as I climbed higher, the air growing cooler. The trail was barely visible now, more of an impression in the grass than a real path. But I had my compass, my map. I wasn't worried about getting lost. Then I saw the footprints. Fresh, not mine. They cut through the grass, leading up the ridge. Deep, clear, not distorted by wind or rain. Someone had been here, recently. My hands felt cold despite the sun. I looked around, scanning the trees, the rocks, the spaces between them. Nothing moved, but I knew I wasn't alone. I kept walking, forcing myself to stay calm. I told myself it was just another hiker, someone I hadn't seen. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The sun was getting lower now, dipping toward the horizon. I needed to find a place to set up camp. I didn't want to stop, but I had no choice. The ridge was too steep to climb in the dark. I found a flat patch of ground near a cluster of boulders. It was sheltered from the wind, a good spot. I set up my tent quickly, my movements stiff, uneasy. I didn't light a fire. I didn't want to be seen. I ate a protein bar, drank some water, listened to the forest around me. The wind whispered through the trees, dry branches shifting, creaking, but no birds, no insects, nothing. I climbed into my tent, zipped it shut. I lay there for a long time, staring at the ceiling, listening. At some point, I drifted off. Then a sound. Soft, slow, footsteps. I snapped awake, my body rigid. The footsteps were close, circling my tent. Not an animal, not the random rustling of the wind. Someone was out there. I gripped my knife, my breath shallow. The steps stopped. Silence. I waited. Minutes, hours, nothing. Eventually, exhaustion took over. I must have slept, because when I opened my eyes again, the sky was pale gray, the first light of dawn stretching over the ridge. I sat up, my muscles stiff, my throat dry. Then I saw it, just outside my tent. A single footprint, closer than before. I packed my gear in minutes, shoving everything into my pack without caring how. I started moving, fast. The ridge was steep, the path narrow, winding between sharp rocks. My legs burned, my breath came hard, but I didn't stop. I needed to get out. I followed the trail down, moving as quickly as I could without slipping. Every few minutes, I checked behind me. Nothing, but the feeling was still there. That pressure, that weight, like eyes on my back. The trail flattened out near the base of the ridge, leading into a dense stand of trees. The last stretch before the road. I moved faster, then movement. Up ahead, a shape, a figure, standing half hidden in the trees, still as stone. I stopped. My heart slammed against my ribs. Then it moved, not toward me, not away, just shifted slightly. Watching, I didn't think. I just ran. Branches whipped at my face, my boots slipping on loose dirt. I ran until my chest ached, until my vision blurred. I burst out of the trees onto the gravel road where my truck was parked. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the door open. I didn't look back. I started the engine, peeled out, the tires skidding on loose gravel. I drove for miles before I could breathe again. I never told anyone what happened. I never went back. I still hike, but never alone, never off trail, because some places aren't meant to be explored. And some things, once they find you, they don't let go. Hiking the Colorado Trail with my dad was something we had been planning for a while. It wasn't the whole trail, just a section, but it was still a serious trip. Long miles, unpredictable weather, and the kind of terrain that could wear you down if you weren't prepared. I'd been hiking since I was a kid, and my dad had been the one to get me into it, so I wasn't too worried about handling the trail itself. But the wilderness always had surprises, and this trip ended up giving us one that I still think about. We had started out early in the morning, boots crunching over dirt and rock as we moved along the trail. The weather was perfect, clear blue sky, just enough breeze to keep us from sweating too much. The mountains stretched out in every direction, endless ridges fading into the distance. It felt like we were the only people out there, which was exactly what we wanted. The first couple of days were pretty routine. We hiked, set up camp, made food, and got up the next morning to do it all over again. Nothing unusual, but on the third day, things started to feel a little different. It was mid-afternoon, and we were moving through a dense section of forest. The trees presa in close on both sides of the trail, thick trunks and tangled undergrowth making it hard to see more than a few yards off the path. The air smelled like pine and damp earth. The ground was soft with fallen needles, muffling our footsteps. That was when we heard it, a deep, heavy noise somewhere in the trees. At first, I wasn't sure I had even heard anything at all. It was just a low, rumbling sound, almost like the wind moving through the branches. But then it came again, louder this time, a heavy snort. I stopped walking. My dad stopped too. Moose. That was my first thought. It had to be a moose. Moose aren't like deer. They don't spook and run when they see people. They don't avoid you. They're big, they're aggressive, and they don't care if you're in their way. A bull moose in the wrong mood could turn a quiet afternoon into a serious problem fast. We moved carefully, keeping our voices low, scanning the trees ahead. The sound came again. Deep, heavy breathing, the rustling of something large moving through the undergrowth. Then we saw the tracks. They were big, too big for deer, too rounded for elk. Definitely moose. We slowed down, walking cautiously. My heart was already pounding a little harder than it should have been. I wasn't scared exactly, but I was on edge. When you're out in the middle of nowhere, miles from help, a bad encounter with wildlife isn't just a scary story. It's a real problem. Then we saw it. Through the trees, just beyond a break in the undergrowth, something large was moving. Dark, solid. A massive body shifting through the brush. Moose. Had to be. But something was off. The shape wasn't quite right. Moose had long legs, that distinctive humped back, big, awkward heads. Whatever was moving in the trees, it didn't have that shape. It was big, sure, but it was different. It stepped into the clearing. Not a moose, a cow. Just a regular, black and white cow, standing in the middle of the forest like it belonged there. For a second, my brain refused to process what I was seeing. My whole body had been braced for a moose. Heart pounding, muscles tense, every instinct telling me to be careful. And then, suddenly, I was just staring at a cow. It looked at us. We looked at it. Then it turned and wandered off into the trees, as if we weren't even there. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. My dad exhaled too, shaking his head. We kept walking, and a few minutes later, we saw more of them. A whole herd. Cows just there, in the woods. It didn't make sense. There were no farms anywhere near this part of the trail.
No pastures, no ranches.
Just wilderness. And yet, here they were, a dozen or more cows, grazing in the trees like they had been there forever. For some reason, the whole thing felt weird. It wasn't like seeing a bear or hearing coyotes in the distance. That would have made sense. This didn't. We kept walking, and eventually we left them behind. The trail climbed higher, and soon we were out of the trees, moving into more open country. I don't know why that moment stuck with me the way it did. It wasn't scary, not really. It wasn't dangerous. But for some reason, I still think about those cows. The cabin had been in my family for generations. My grandfather built it back in the 1950s, a small, sturdy structure deep in the woods of northern Maine. He used it for hunting, and later my father would take us there in the summers. I had good memories of the place, though it had been years since I last visited. When my father passed away, the cabin became mine. It was more of a burden than a gift. I had no use for it, no desire to spend time in the woods. But after my divorce, I needed a break from the world. I needed silence, space, a place to think. So I packed my truck with supplies: canned food, bottled water, a rifle, extra blankets, and enough firewood to last a week. I left early, hoping to reach the cabin before nightfall. The drive was long and lonely. The last hour was nothing but dirt roads, winding through thick forest. The trees were tall and close, their bare branches tangling together overhead. It was late October, the air cold and sharp, carrying the faint smell of decaying leaves. When I finally arrived, the cabin looked smaller than I remembered. The wood was weathered, the roof patched with rusted tin. There was a porch out front, its steps sagging under years of neglect. The windows were grimy, the glass cracked in places. I parked the truck beside the cabin and got out, the air biting at my face. It was quiet, the kind of silence that made your ears ring. No traffic noise, no hum of power lines, just the wind in the trees and the crunch of leaves underfoot. I grabbed my bag and unlocked the door. The inside was dark and musty, the air stale from being closed up for so long. There was one main room with a small kitchen area, a table and a single chair. The wood stove sat in the corner, next to a pile of firewood. A narrow staircase led up to a loft where the old cot was tucked away. I dropped my bag on the table and took a deep breath. This was what I wanted, time alone, away from everything. Settling in the first night was uneventful. I built a fire in the stove, heated up a can of soup, and sat at the table, listening to the wood crackle. Outside, the wind picked up, making the cabin creak and groan. The trees swayed in the darkness, their branches scraping against the roof. I went to bed early, burrowed deep in my sleeping bag. The loft was drafty, the old cot sagging in the middle, but I was too tired to care. I fell asleep to the sound of the wind and the occasional snap of a branch. In the morning, I woke up to a cold, gray light seeping through the window. I made coffee on the old propane stove and sat on the porch, looking out at the trees. The forest was dense, the undergrowth thick and tangled. The only sign of civilization was the narrow dirt path that led back to the road. I spent the day exploring. There were old trails leading through the woods, barely visible under layers of fallen leaves. I followed one down to the river, its water dark and sluggish, choked with fallen branches. The air was still, the sky heavy with clouds that threatened rain. On my way back, I noticed something strange. A tree near the cabin had deep cuts in its bark. They were old, the wood scarred and darkened, but they formed a distinct pattern. 3 slashes, one above the other, like something had clawed at the tree long ago. I ran my fingers over the marks, the wood rough under my touch. I had never seen them before, never noticed them as a kid. It was probably nothing, just damage from some long-gone animal. I shook off the unease and headed back to the cabin, the wind picking up again, rustling the leaves around my feet. The first night that night, I kept the fire burning high. The stove glowed with heat, casting flickering light across the walls. I sat by the window, watching the darkness outside, trying to let the quiet settle my mind. But the silence was heavy, oppressive. I climbed into the loft early, the rifle resting against the wall within arm's reach. I didn't think I'd need it, but it was comforting to have it close. Sometime in the night, I woke up to a noise. At first, I thought it was the wind, a low, hollow sound moving through the trees. But then I heard it again. Footsteps, soft, deliberate, crunching through the leaves outside. My breath caught in my throat. I lay still, ears straining, my heart pounding in my chest. The footsteps stopped. A long silence. Then the faintest tap against the window. Once, then again. Slow, rhythmic. I reached for the rifle, my hands shaking. I stayed frozen, listening. The tapping stopped. Minutes passed, then an hour. Eventually, I drifted off again, my body too tired to stay awake. The second day in the morning, I found the tracks. They were human, barefoot, They led from the tree line to the cabin, circling around it, stopping just below the loft window. My stomach twisted as I stared at them. They weren't mine, and they were fresh, the edges sharp in the frost. I scanned the woods, half expecting to see someone standing there, watching from the shadows. But the trees were empty. I spent the day on edge, checking the windows, testing the locks, making sure the rifle was loaded. The forest felt darker, the trees pressing in close. That night, I locked the door, pulled the chair against it, and kept the rifle in my lap as I sat by the stove. The fire flickered, casting long shadows across the walls. I didn't sleep. I stayed awake, listening for the slightest sound, the wind howling against the cabin, the branches scraping against the roof. But nothing came. I don't know what made me pick that particular weekend. Maybe it was the stress of work. Maybe it was just the need to get away. But when Friday rolled around, I packed up my gear, threw everything in the truck, and drove out to the most isolated stretch of forest I could find. I had camped alone plenty of times before. It wasn't a big deal, but something about this trip felt different. I didn't listen to that feeling. I should have. The place I chose wasn't on any marked trail. It was deep in public land, a patch of thick forest about 4 hours from the nearest town. The road leading in was more of a suggestion than an actual road. Narrow, overgrown, barely wide enough for my truck. I didn't see a single other car, no other campers, just trees and silence. I found a place to park where the road dead-ended into brush too thick to drive through. From there, I had to hike in. That was the plan. Get as deep as possible. Be alone. The first few miles were fine. The air was crisp, the trees were thick, and I made good time. I had my pack, my tent, my supplies, a topo map and compass. No GPS, no cell signal. That was the point. By mid-afternoon, I found a spot that seemed perfect. A flat clearing near a creek, sheltered by trees. I set up camp, got a fire going. Everything was normal, until the sun started setting. I don't know what made me notice it. Maybe it was just the way the light changed or how the wind shifted, but suddenly everything felt wrong, like I wasn't alone. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the trees. Nothing, just dense woods. But something in my gut told me to listen. The birds had gone silent. The wind had stopped. It was that kind of quiet that only happens when something is watching. I told myself it was just my imagination. I went to bed. The noise. I woke up sometime after midnight. First, I didn't know why. Then I heard it. A snap. A branch breaking. Close. I held my breath, listening. Silence. Then another snap. My tent was sealed shut, but I didn't dare move. Something was outside. I stayed like that for what felt like hours. Not moving. Not breathing. Listening. Sometimes I heard shuffling. Sometimes nothing. I gripped my knife so hard my hand went numb. At some point, the sound stopped, but I didn't sleep. I waited for morning. When the first light touched the trees, I finally unzipped the tent. Nothing was there. I stepped outside, my body stiff from staying still so long. That's when I saw them. Tracks. Not mine. They circled my tent. I crouched, studying them. Bare feet. Not a bear. Not a person with shoes. Just bare, human footprints. Deep. Heavy. I stared at them for a long time. Then I started packing. I moved fast. Tent down. Gear packed. I wasn't staying another night. I checked my map, took my compass reading, and started hiking back to my truck. But something was wrong. The trail I had made, the one I had followed in so easily, was gone. I stopped, turned in a slow circle. The forest looked different, denser, like I had never been there before. I took out my compass, checked my heading, started walking. After an hour, I knew I was lost. I wasn't panicking, not yet, but the landscape didn't match my map. The terrain was wrong. No creek, no familiar landmarks, just trees, endless trees. The feeling came back, that prickle on the back of my neck, that sinking in my gut, like I was being watched. I stopped, listened, nothing, Then a sound. Not a branch breaking, not an animal. Breathing. Somewhere behind me. I turned so fast I nearly fell. Nothing there. Just trees. I didn't make it back to my truck. I had to camp. I built no fire. I didn't eat. I just set up my tent, climbed inside, and waited for morning. I barely slept. Sometime in the night, I heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate, circling. By dawn, I was moving. I forced myself to think logically. Follow the sun. Keep heading east. Find the road. Find my truck. By noon, I saw something through the trees. Not my truck. Not a road. Something hanging. I stopped. It was a deer, strung up by its hind legs, gutted, swinging slightly in the breeze. But there was no blood. I backed away, turned, and that's when I saw the other footprints. A second set, bigger. I didn't stop running until I reached the road. I drove away so fast I nearly wrecked. I didn't stop until I was miles away, back in cell range. I told myself I was just being paranoid, that it was just some hunter's kill. But deep down I knew, no hunter had been out there. No hunter had walked around my tent all night. And no hunter had been barefoot. I never went back, and I never will. I had planned the trip for months, a solo hike through the Cascade Mountains, deep into the wilderness, miles away from any sign of civilization. The route I mapped out would take me through thick forests, across ridges, and down into valleys few people ever saw. It was exactly what I wanted. Complete solitude, surrounded by nature, nothing but my own strength and skill to keep me going. I packed everything carefully. My backpack was heavy with food, water, gear, and emergency supplies. My boots were broken in, my layers planned for the unpredictable mountain weather. I even had a satellite beacon in case something went seriously wrong. I had done solo trips before, but nothing this remote, nothing this demanding. This was the real test. The first day was perfect. The trail was steep, but my legs were fresh, and the air smelled like pine and damp earth. The sun broke through the trees in golden beams, lighting up the moss-covered ground. I followed the trail up into the hills, climbing higher, leaving behind the last signs of human activity. By midday, I had reached the ridgeline, a narrow path cutting along the mountain with steep drop-offs on either side. The view stretched for miles, endless forested slopes rolling toward the horizon, untouched, wild. That night, I set up camp by a small alpine lake. The water was so clear I could see the smooth stones at the bottom. The only sounds were the occasional rustling of wind through the trees and the distant call of an owl. I ate, stretched out in my sleeping bag, and felt completely at peace. The second day, I pushed deeper. The trail became rougher, barely more than an old game path in some places. I had to watch my footing constantly, stepping over exposed roots, loose rocks, patches of mud. I kept moving, pacing myself, drinking water, eating small handfuls of nuts and dried fruit to keep my energy up. I crossed a narrow stream around midday and decided to refill my water bottles. As I crouched by the bank, filtering the cold, clear water, I noticed something strange, a footprint in the mud. It was fresh, the edges still crisp. Not an animal print, a human boot. That didn't make sense. I had followed a rarely used route, far from any maintained trails. The last sign of people I had seen was miles back. Maybe someone had passed through before me, but the print looked too fresh, made within the last few hours. I scanned the area. Nothing, just trees and undergrowth, silent and undisturbed. No sounds of movement, no other tracks nearby. I kept going. Maybe another hiker had the same idea as me, taking this off-trail route. It was strange, but not impossible. I hiked for hours, climbing over fallen logs, pushing through dense brush, my legs burning with effort. By late afternoon, I reached a narrow valley with steep rock walls on either side. The air was cooler here, the sun already disappearing behind the cliffs. The map showed a faint trail cutting through, leading up the other side toward another ridge. I followed it, moving carefully over loose scree and sharp rocks. Then I saw something that made my stomach tighten. A backpack, torn open, lying against the base of the cliff. It was old, sun-bleached, the fabric shredded as if animals had gotten to it. But it hadn't been there long. There was no moss, no dirt buildup. It looked like it had been abandoned months ago, maybe a year at most. I nudged it with my boot. Empty. No supplies, no ID, nothing to say who it belonged to. My mind raced. Had someone gotten hurt here? Had they fallen? I scanned the cliffside, but there was no sign of bones, no remnants of clothing caught on the rocks. I checked my map again. I was miles from any known campsite. This place wasn't on any official trails. The light was fading fast. I needed to find a place to camp before dark. I hiked another mile up the valley and found a flat spot beneath a rocky overhang. It wasn't ideal, but it was better than nothing. I set up my tent, cooked a quick meal, and tried to shake off the uneasy feeling in my gut. That night, I barely slept. I kept waking up, heart pounding, convinced I had heard something outside the tent. Every sound, the wind shifting through the trees, the rustle of leaves, felt wrong, too close, too deliberate. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps, slow, careful, stopping just beyond the thin fabric wall. I held my breath. Nothing. I waited, listening, my muscles tensed. Still nothing. I told myself it was just my imagination, the isolation getting to me, but I kept my knife close, gripping it tight until my fingers ached. By dawn, I was already packed and moving. I didn't want to stay there any longer than I had to. The trail climbed sharply, taking me up and out of the valley. My legs burned, my pack felt heavier than before. The silence pressed down on me.
No birds, no insects.
Just the sound of my own breathing, my own footsteps crunching over dirt and stone. Then I saw it. Another footprint, fresh, and this time it wasn't mine. I stared at it, my skin prickling. Someone else was out here, someone moving in the same direction as me. I kept hiking, faster now, pushing myself. I wanted to be out of this area, back on a real trail, anywhere but here. My lungs burned, my pulse hammered in my ears. Then, ahead on the trail, something moved. A shape half hidden by the trees. Tall, human. I froze. The figure stood there, just beyond the edge of the trail, watching. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Then it stepped back, vanishing into the trees. I ran. I didn't think, didn't look back. I ran until my legs nearly gave out, until I reached the next ridgeline, where the terrain was too open for anyone to follow me unseen. I kept going, pushing through exhaustion, fear, everything screaming at me to get out. By nightfall, I found a spot far from the trail, hidden between boulders. I barely slept, my knife in my hand, every nerve on edge. The next morning, I moved fast. I hiked for hours, barely stopping, drinking water as I walked, ignoring the pain in my feet. By late afternoon, I reached a marked trail, a real official trail. I had never felt so relieved. I followed it all the way down, my heart pounding with every step. When I finally saw the parking lot, my car sitting exactly where I left it, I almost collapsed. I never found out who was out there. No missing persons reports, no news of lost hikers. Nothing, just footprints in the dirt, and the feeling that, somewhere in those mountains, someone was still watching. I always knew the Canadian wilderness could be unforgiving, but until that day, I had never truly understood what it meant to be helpless. It was the summer of 1981. I was in Nova Scotia, deep in the bush, working on my master's in geology. It was remote research, no roads, no people, no help. Just miles of rugged land, thick forests, and ancient boulder fields carved by glaciers thousands of years ago. I had been out there for weeks, mapping rock formations, noting structural patterns, and gathering samples. No GPS, no cell phone, just a compass, a map, and my field notes. The morning started like any other. I parked my truck on an old logging road, threw my gear over my shoulder, and headed into the bush. I was alone, and I had no idea that by the end of the day, I'd be fighting for my life. By mid-afternoon, I reached a massive boulder field, a stretch of land covered in house-sized rocks, scattered like a giant had dropped them from the sky. Some sat alone, others were stacked, creating deep crevices and voids between them. I had crossed these before. They were tricky, but nothing I couldn't handle. I stepped carefully, testing the moss-covered surfaces before putting my weight down. Some were solid, some weren't. The thick green moss was deceptive. It looked like a smooth path, but it hid slick surfaces and deep gaps. The sun was hot. The air was thick. Sweat dripped down my back as I made my way across. I had crossed about halfway when it happened. My foot slipped. The moss beneath me wasn't solid. It was covering a thin layer of soil over bare, polished rock. The moment I put my weight on it, it gave out. I dropped. My pack hit the rock first, and my legs shot forward. I tried to grab something, anything, but my hands scraped uselessly against the moss. I slid fast, bouncing off one rock, then another, before I suddenly stopped. Not on solid ground. I was wedged. I felt it before I saw it. My body jammed between two massive boulders. My arms were pinned awkwardly at my sides. My left leg twisted. And beneath me, nothing, just blackness, a deep open void. I was hanging. My feet touched nothing. The air below me was cold and empty. I knew, without seeing it, that the drop was far, too far. My stomach turned to ice. For a few moments, I couldn't think. All I could do was breathe, fast, shallow. My chest was heaving. I tried to move. Pain exploded up my leg. My left knee was twisted between the rocks, holding my weight. My right leg dangled into the void, useless. I was stuck, pinned in place, hanging over God knows how deep a drop. I had no way to know how far the fall was. Maybe 20 feet, maybe 50, maybe more. I wasn't willing to find out. I twisted, trying to free my left leg. The pain was instant, sharp, like a knife was being driven into my knee. I gritted my teeth and stopped. I needed a plan. I forced myself to calm down. Panic wouldn't help me. I took slow, deep breaths and assessed my situation. The facts were bad. I was alone. I was wedged in place over a drop I couldn't see. My arms were stuck, and my left leg was twisted in a way it shouldn't be. My backpack with my water, food, and gear was jammed against the rock behind me. I had to get out, but every time I moved, I felt my body shift, felt gravity trying to pull me down, and I realized something even worse. The rock I was wedged against, it was smooth, no cracks, no edges, nothing to grip. Minutes passed, maybe an hour. Sweat poured down my face. My arms were starting to go numb. I twisted, trying to wedge my right arm free. Bad idea. I slipped lower. My heart slammed in my chest. I stopped moving, held my breath. I couldn't make any sudden movements. I needed leverage. That's when I saw it. A root. A tree had grown between the boulders, and one of its roots hung down nearby, thick and sturdy. It was just out of reach. I stared at it, desperate. If I could grab it, I could pull myself up. I shifted, trying to move my left leg without making things worse. Agony. I bit down hard, breathing through the pain. I reached. Nothing. The root was inches away, but I needed more reach. I pushed my right foot against the rock wall, pressing hard. Slowly, painfully, I inched up. Just a little more. My fingers brushed the root. I lunged. My hand closed around it. For the first time in hours, I felt hope. I didn't waste time. I pulled. Hard. First, nothing happened. I was too weak. My arms were shaking, but I gritted my teeth and kept pulling. Every inch felt like a war. 1 inch, then 2. My body screamed. My knee felt like it was going to tear apart, but I kept going. I got my left foot against the rock. pushed, and finally I was free. I rolled onto solid ground, gasping. My body throbbed. My hands were shaking, but I was alive. I lay there for a long time, just breathing. I didn't wait. I had miles to go before I reached my truck, and my body was barely holding together. Every step hurt. My knee was stiff, swelling. I was exhausted, dehydrated, sore, but I didn't stop. The sun was getting low by the time I reached my truck. I collapsed into the driver's seat, hands trembling as I turned the key. The engine rumbled to life. I sat there, staring at the endless stretch of trees in my rearview mirror. That place almost killed me, and no one would have ever found me. I didn't go back the next day, or the day after. I took 2 days off, sitting in a cheap motel, staring at my bruised hands, replaying every second of it in my mind. I had never been that scared in my life. But on the 3rd day, I packed my gear, and I went back, because that's what the wilderness does. It breaks you, then it dares you to come back.